everyone. Welcome back. Today we are talking about Martin Luther. We're talking about the Reformation. We're talking about false claims made by Protestants, false historical claims, assertions that are now known to be completely fabricated about their origins. So the question that I have on the thumbnail is Protestantism apostolic? And this is based on the question, where was your church before Luther? And I've covered previously at length a document that discusses the very unfortunate history of false claims made by the founders of Protestantism, made by the reformers over 200 years, from the 16th to the 18th centuries. And then, of course, they changed approach. Instead of trying to fake or falsely prove that there was an apostolic lineage, they decided to then simply state that they were biblical. And I've gone through the history on this in the past, in a previous episode with the same title. And now we're just looking at what are the implications, what are the things we can infer from that, and just a few more ideas as to why this was patently false. And we have to ask ourselves, why would the founders of Protestantism, the founders of the various denominations, make absurd, ahistorical, easily proven false claims? So let's go here. So welcome, Joel, and welcome, Tom. Good to see you guys. And for the rest, great to have you here this evening. This is a really, it's a pickle. It's a quandary. So I'm just going to get my slides ready. And get my screen up. And so this is part 2 of this. I will finish this today. But for those who watched the first part, I'd be very curious, what are your thoughts on this? What were your thoughts as I went through the evidence during part 1? Did you disagree with anything that I said? I mean, given that the data is, I think, extremely compelling and persuasive, and of course it's historically based. This is not something that is easily dismissed as fabrication, because it's true. It is written in the history of all of these Protestant denominations. Every single one is guilty of making claims that tie directly to heretics, to people who deny basic Christian theology, who are clearly anti-Christian, but in the effort to prove an apostolic lineage, they appeal to these people. It's like appealing to Satanists and Muslims to say, look how we are apostolic. It's genuinely disturbing. So let's continue. We ended here, so I'll just recap on this slide and we'll continue to slide number 40. I've added 1 or 2 slides of additional detail. So there's some logical contradictions that we came across. So for instance, apostolic claims are that apostolic succession went through medieval sects, and these sects were buried, these sects were secretly hiding in caves or doing whatever. They were suppressed by the Catholic Church, but these sects had true apostolic Christianity. They were practicing this for centuries in hiding, in secret, and therefore they were these apostolic Protestants because they were derived from these other groups. Of course, these heretical groups were not remotely Christian, and these heretical groups themselves couldn't agree. That they were vastly in conflict with each other. It's completely grafted apologetics. Is Lloyd an Anglican? Yes, Lloyd has said so about 1,000 times on this channel. I've said so many times. So yeah. Do you have any questions? Are you going to go, well, if you're a Baptist, then I don't believe you, or oh yeah, if you're a raxalated evangelical, then we don't believe you? We're discussing basic history, because these reformers and these major founders of these denominations made ludicrous, completely false, even fabricated historical claims. And these are the founders and the fathers of these Protestant denominations who, okay, welcome. So hello and welcome then. So yes, I come from a long Anglican lineage. I have an uncle who's a bishop. I've had uncles who are priests. I've had family who've worked at places like King's College in London. So yeah, I come from a very, very church-oriented family, and then when I started looking into some of the history, let's just say it wasn't exactly as I'd been told. So they claimed that there was continuity of the early church, and they claimed they followed biblical authority alone. But we know now, with hindsight, with better research methods, with the internet, of course, you can find these things, more easily get this information. These medieval sects held heretical doctrines. We're not talking ambiguously so, we're talking undeniably. Many rejected biblical authority as outright heretics. They rejected large parts of the Bible, for instance. No institutional continuity can be proven. There's none. There's none. These people die out maybe in the 12th century at best. So there's no way they can prove any kind of apostolic lineage. And of course, these groups all held contradictory theological positions. So they were appealing to, as the document that we first showed, Where Was Your Church Before Luther by Barnett showed, the Protestants would continually refer to different groups once the first group was proven to be completely heretical, using completely unbiblical or genuinely anti-Christian positions. They would just default to the next, to the next, to the next, until eventually they ran out of heretics they could turn to as true Christians. Hello, Sergeant Grinch. Where are you? Sergeant Grinch, welcome. You're in the ICU. I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Sergeant Grinch. Everyone, please pray for his health. And look, I'm glad you've joined us, and I hope we can keep you entertained for the next hour. But let's hope and pray for your health and recovery. And looking forward to seeing you soon then, without you having to be in the ICU and ill. Right. So let's continue. So what we have is, I want to go through a logical unpacking of some of the problems. Then I'll introduce some additional evidence, and we'll go through that. Grafted says, as a Protestant myself, I'm well aware of the big disconnect between Protestantism, at least modern Protestantism, and apostolic churches. It's not just a disconnect. I mean, that's a polite way of putting it. The history it does not look good for Protestants whatsoever. It merely just proves desperate attempts at fabrication, anything to prove some kind of apostolic lineage. Sergeant Grinch says, I love these history lessons. Well, thanks, man. Glad to be here. Glad you're here. Glad to be here with you and me. I love the history as well. It's really fascinating. Of course, the conclusions one has to draw are, just definitely not pleasant for many people. So the heretical doctrines problem. So the Albigensian Manichaean dualism. Matter is evil, spirit is good. Now, these people, one of the other groups that were appealed to by various Protestant leaders, they believe that the physical world was created by an evil force, an evil God. Of course, we know in Genesis, God made the world and it was good, and God is good. But these people believe that, no, the world was made by an evil God, that all matter is corrupt. So this violates basic Christian doctrine. It violates basic biblical meaning. And of course, Protestant founders were like, those guys definitely true original Christians. The Catholic Church persecuted them unfairly. Look how good these Christians. And it turns out to be a completely false position. Welcome, guys. So the rejection of the Old Testament as the work of the evil God. So the Albigensians, another group that the Protestants turned to as true Christians, true apostolic Christians who were suppressed and went underground and protected Christianity from those evil Catholics. Well, these Albigensians dismissed the Old Testament. They claimed that its God was not the true good God. Again, so we're looking at 0 for 2 here, and that's not good. These groups would deny Christ's true humanity, which is Docetism. So Christ only, according to these Albigensians, appeared to have a physical body. They rejected the incarnation, which is something that is fundamental to Christian orthodoxy. Many of these groups would reject marriage, procreation, and the material world, because to marry was to then create more children, but children are corrupt because they're made of matter. Matter is evil. Why would you continue this evil, destructive matter, this evil force? You are then simply just multiplying the effects of the evil God. So marriage and having children would discourage. It perpetuated the material world that they saw as evil. And then we want to talk about ritual suicide for the love of God, of course. You kill yourself to make the world a better place, which of course you see today in the Green Movement. So Cathar Perfecti suicide practices called endura. So the most devout would seek ritual death They would starve themselves to death to escape the material world, a practice called endura. Now, the Catholic Church, of course, viewed this as suicide, but the Cathars saw this as spiritual discipline. Of course, many of the reformers were going, yeah, those Cathars, great Christians, awesome Christians. I mean, good grief, those Catholics are evil, but these Cathars, those guys were the original Christians, true Christians. Jesus would be so proud of them. But yeah, they practice ritual suicide. Now, I want to bring up this note here by the National Library of Medicine in PubMed, the Endura of the Cathars. Heresy, medieval concept of ritual euthanasia or suicide. Now, this article speaks of them as the voluntary death of the severely sick, which is false. Okay, this frames it. This was only something linked to the severely sick, but that is false. But this was the Cathars' medieval concept of a ritual euthanasia. So yeah, so even this document, this PubMed, that's got a DOI number here, it speaks about this. So this is a well-known thing, and of course, yeah, we've got Protestant leaders going, yeah, those Cathars, the good guys, definitely the good guys. Kill yourself for God. So now these doctrines obviously fundamentally contradict Protestant theology. In fact, they just are fundamentally evil. But these beliefs oppose core Christian teachings on creation, incarnation, marriage, and the goodness of life, making Protestant praise of the Albigensians theologically indefensible. But they had different motives for doing this. But now, of course, with time, with history, with better research, we can see why they did this. But again, those reasons are indefensible. So yeah, horrifying history. So Grafted says, that's interesting. I never knew this. I mean, definitely never fully agree with Luther or Calvin, but I didn't know they actually affirmed previous anathema. Yeah, no, it's worse than you realize. It is far worse than you realize. When you go through the actual writings of Calvin and the writings of Luther, you will find incredibly disturbing things, which generally do not get discussed for obvious reasons. But yeah, there's a lot that is very disturbing. Government-assisted euthanasia. Yeah, ask yourself where these ideas are coming from, Joel. Ask yourself. And Porfirio Santiago de Guzman Jimenez says, if you also think about it, Protestants who reject the idea of having images is not only a form of iconoclasm, but a form of Manichaeanism if they believe that God cannot use images or matter. Very interesting point. You know, that's worth, drop that in the chat, in the comments later. Just maybe I can look that up and see if I can find any historical links to that. So, yeah. Now, John Wesley praised medieval Manichaeism. I'm just doing a quick summary of a little bit of the previous episode of part 1, and I'm going to do a little bit of a logical analysis, and then I'll add a bit more information to go through some of this, right? So John Wesley, right, the Methodist, he praised, and he's a former Anglican, he praised Manichaeism, sorry, today my tongue is just twisted, as pure Christianity. So Wesley astonishingly described Manichaean groups as embodying authentic Christian faith. I mean, to put it mildly, that's retarded. That is utterly retarded. But he did. So he endorsed groups that rejected biblical authority. So he commended sects that dismissed parts of Scripture. But then, of course, when we go through Martin Luther's history and the copious writings of Martin Luther from Luther's works, Martin Luther also rejected large parts of Scripture. Martin Luther disagreed vehemently large parts of Scripture. So, yeah, no surprise. And, of course, these groups also rejected traditional Christian canon. Now, he supported sects that denied Christ's humanity. So Wesley's praise extended to groups that even denied the incarnation, which is a core Christian doctrine. Christ was born from a virgin. He was born as a human being. He lived, he suffered death, he was buried, and then, of course, raised on the third day. That is core Christian doctrine. He contradicted his own Methodist theological foundations. These endorsements conflicted directly with the essential beliefs of Methodism and Protestantism, were supposedly biblical. So he was quite happy to indulge in this fabrication. Who knows why? Well, we'll have a look at that. To suit a particular agenda that was rife at the time. This also, again, reveals the desperation of Protestant historical revisionism. This kind of praise highlights the extreme lengths that Protestants went to construct a pre-Reformation lineage. The question being, where was your church before Luther? And this was their answer. yeah, we're going to go to all these guys who reject the Bible, reject God, reject Jesus. We're going to call them awesome Christians because the Catholics are evil. Yeah, not a good plan, but that was the plan they went with. So Di Antonovich says another good explainer why Catholicism is the one which meets the most requirements. And yes, actually, once you put the history side by side, work through it logically, the Catholic Church has a very strong position, of course. So Porfirio says, absolutely, there are many Eastern Orthodox who make the point as well. And I'll drop it in the comments after the live stream. Thanks. Look, I will say I am very skeptical of Eastern Orthodoxy. I have reasons to be extremely skeptical. I've spoken about this many times. I haven't gone into any depth. I haven't covered that at great depth. By the way, I've just finished two detailed sets of slides on Catholicism, so I will be going through those soon, but I've got a bunch of other slides I want to get through that I've finished. I finished about 5 slide decks this week. I've been extremely busy. But yeah, we'll do them piece by piece. For sure, I'm Protestant by way of culture, birth, and entry into the faith, not by any sense of actual doctrinal submission or agreement to the first reformers. Well, and the thing is that, but if you live in a guy's house, you eat his food, you use the same phrases, you do the same things. You live in his house, you drive his car, you make the same statements, you have the same worldview, and then you claim I've got nothing to do with those guys. It doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite fit because, remember, they were separated from Catholicism. And they would take oppositional positions. They were protesting against Catholicism. So when you repeat those same things, I do scripture alone, I do faith alone, and all of these other statements, or you say, no, I have a right to decide my own because of the priesthood of all, that's all Martin Luther's nonsense, Calvin's nonsense, Zwingli's nonsense. And so of course you're attached to that particular lineage. You're part and parcel of that particular, you're under that umbrella. So Grafted says, I've largely known about the indulgencies, controversies, and how the Reformation started. Even Martin Luther states in his own writings that his issue was not indulgences, was just a minor issue. In fact, I believe it was just a pretext. But even Martin Luther writes in his own writings that indulgences was not the reason for his schism, that his issue, right, which he, in his debates with Erasmus, he states, you, Erasmus, you have identified the crux of the issue where I have a problem with the Catholics. And that, Martin Luther states, is free will, because Martin Luther did not believe in free will. So this was the issue of free will. I've covered that previously in discussions on free will and his discussions with Erasmus. And also Martin Luther had severe issues with the scholastics, with reason, with logic. Martin Luther despised those, despite claims to the contrary by various supposed scholars and theologians who are dedicated to the truth. When you just read Martin Luther's own words, you discover very quickly that these theologians are either misled or they're just flat out lying. But given what I've learned about Protestant history so far, that is no surprise to me. The Orthodox death to the world movement crosses my mind. I realize it means death to the passions, but there's borders on Gnosticism. Yes, there is a very interesting point there. Eastern Orthodoxy, which one? Yeah, the whole lot of them. But yeah, generally the whole lot. If you look at the founding, where it starts from, when I look at the history there, I've gone through that on my own, spent a few hours examining that, and it just looks suspect. So to me, okay, that says a lot when this was their best appeal to historical legitimacy, older heretical movements. Exactly, because Martin Luther would repeat things. Martin Luther was praising heretics as well. He was praising groups that are clearly heretical, talking flaming heretics, not just a guy who got a typo in his dissertation on Jesus. No, we're talking flaming heretics. Yeah, Jesus declared, I'm truly a servant of Allah. Jesus never heard of Allah. In fact, yes, hold on. The Arabs had heard of Allah. Allah was also known as Baal, because Muhammad was consecrated to Allah, who was known as Baal, as we can see in the Sirah. And then, of course, if you go to the family of Muhammad, they all worshipped Baal because Baal was the head god of the Kaaba. And of course, Baal is mentioned in the Bible as a pagan god. Children were sacrificed to him, and so on and so on. So really, I have no interest in your... I genuinely have no interest in your Islamic nonsense. So tell you what, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to put you in timeout for 24 hours. So yeah, we have a completely different discussion going on here. Let me see. So yeah. So anyway, What have I missed? Okay, nothing interesting. If you can give me any verses from a Synoptic Bible that Jesus claimed to be God, which is the first three earlier, there are plenty, dozens of references where Jesus says he is God. There are plenty. But of course, for Muslims, don't forget, in Islam, lying is obligatory. Under the Sharia, lying is an obligatory duty. Muslims are obligated to lie for Allah for the benefit of Islam. This is not just permitted, it is obligatory, right? It's an obligation. So you need to understand this about Islam to understand where these people are coming from. They simply just don't accept. They want the words "I am God," but of course, even when he does say that, or uses all of the symbolism that would be understood by the Jews of the era, of course, they reject that. So yeah, I mean, if you can show us where in the Quran we have the names of all Muhammad's wives, right? You get that from a third-party source, and when we show you what those third-party sources say, you reject those as weak and unreliable. Where's the Shahada that says that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah? Where's the double Shahada in the Quran? It doesn't exist, right? Where does the Quran teach you how to do the 5 daily prayers? It doesn't. It's all in the Sirah or in the Hadiths, right? And then you claim that those Hadiths are fabricated. So yeah, and show us where before Muhammad Allah was not a pagan deity. Show us where before Muhammad Allah was not a pagan deity. Allah always was. Allah was a pagan deity in Arabia before Muhammad. There was, why does the Quran not even know the name of the God of the Bible, Yahweh? Has no idea. Why does the Quran talk about chainmail, right, in centuries where it wasn't invented yet? Why does it talk about paper money amongst groups that never had paper money? Why does the Quran talk about... Anyway, there's just far too many anachronisms. There are far too many gaps. There are far too many issues in the Quran. So, but yeah, we're not here to talk about that. Okay, so what you've got is, right, this reveals the extreme lengths that the Protestants went to construct a pre-Reformation apostolic lineage. So Wesley's stance showed a readiness to align with heretical movements simply because they opposed Rome. That was the only reason. Right? If you read the paper that I referred to, it should be in the description as well. If you read that paper, it was anything but Catholicism. And as long as you rejected Catholicism, you could believe that Jesus was a three-legged, purple-haired dog that came to lick your face to bring you salvation. And if you fed him dog food, he would give you double reward in heaven. And if you believed that about Jesus, as long as you didn't like Rome, you were good to go. You were part of the Protestant club. It was that ridiculous. And unfortunately, that's the history. So Barnett's paper tells us that the anything but Catholicism practice led Protestants to very uncritically, and this is all the denominations are guilty of this, to assimilate medieval opponents of Rome, including those with demonstrably heretical doctrines, into a proto-Protestant lineage simply because they were anti-Catholic. As long as you're anti-Catholic, you were part of the club. So they weren't very fussy. Now, there's also an Anglican inconsistency we mentioned before. So, yeah, A. Blackamore condemned Albigensians as heretical. But of course, all the other Anglicans were saying, no, these are the good guys. We're with them. They're with us. Those are the original Christians. Now, here's a simple question. I will come to this question later, but I will ask you, if these heretical groups, if these insanely heretical groups were the early Christians, the original, despite the fact that not one of these groups agrees on anything. They've got doctrines that are wildly all over the place and contradictory. But if these were the original Christians, why didn't Calvin become an Albigensian? Why didn't Calvin join them? If these guys were the authentic, original apostolic Christians, why didn't Calvin become one of them? Why didn't Luther become one of them? Why didn't Wesley join them? If these guys were the original Christians, why did none of the reformers become one of them? Kind of a weird thing. So I get where you're coming from, the whole you live under his roof analogy, but obviously this is monolithic. Unfortunately, if you're not Catholic, you're one of them. It's as simple as that. So the claim that it's not monolithic doesn't matter. You're part of a particular group. You've got this side of the stream and you've got that side of the stream, and your group is that side of the stream. It's that simple. You're either this side or that side. And unfortunately, all of these ideas come from a source. And then, of course, people started to take and pick and choose and develop their own variants and versions, but they fall under the same umbrella. It's that simple. You're either one of these or you're one of these. Now, here you've got all sorts, right? You've got all sorts over here. and you've got a single doctrine here. But yeah, you've got a whole riot of contradictory, incompatible ideas, right? Calvinists, the main issue here, take for instance the well-known famous one, Calvinists and Arminians. They can't agree. They haven't agreed for 500 years. Nobody can solve it. But they're all Christians, right? They have totally incompatible doctrines, completely incompatible, utterly contradictory doctrines. Both can't be right. One must be false. And we can do the same. We can do comparisons across numerous of these Protestant groups. Someone must be wrong, but they all claim to be led by the Spirit. They all disagree and contradict each other. Someone must be wrong. It's not even an option. Clearly, there's a massive amount of falsehood there. So yeah, they all fall under that same banner. So let me see. Okay, so let's go on. So Blackamoor openly denounced the Albigensians for their unorthodox beliefs. So, I mean, he eventually wrote against this, and the Anglicans had to get their heads out of their bums because they realized, yeah, we're making fools of ourselves. Other Anglicans, at the same time, though, were claiming them as ancestors. So some Anglicans portrayed the Albigensians as spiritual forerunners of Protestantism. So, of course, you have internal Protestant contradictions on the same historical groups, and this resulted in Protestants both rejecting and embracing the same group, depending on the argument. And, of course, Barnett's paper shows you that this argument shifted when they were embarrassed on one issue. They would suddenly shift to another group and then change the argument. And it just shifted like that over the decades for 200 years until they changed the argument completely, and we'll get into that. So this shows there's a lack of coherent Protestant historical narrative. So there's no unified or consistent Protestant account of church history. Everybody has a different one. None of them agree. So this is very shoddy scholarship. This is Zucker-Nike levels of academic rigor. So there was selective use of history for polemical purposes. So historical facts were chosen or ignored based on their usefulness in debates with Catholics. Very simple. And this also shows us the arbitrary nature of Protestant historical claims, because the shifting portrayal of groups like the Albigensians highlights the subjective and extremely opportunistic approach to history of the Protestant founders. So you have the invisible church issue. Now, doctrine was invented to explain the lack of a visible institutional continuity, like the Catholic Church can trace through something like 263 popes over the decades, and they can show there's a continual legacy of institution, belief, doctrine, and going back to written historical sources. Remember, Martin Luther simply stated that do not believe anybody, no church father, nor even people greater than the church fathers, meaning the apostles, if their name is not Martin Luther, because he wanted people to believe him alone and not to follow history. So this whole invisible church concept was created to justify the absence of a continuous organized Protestant presence before the Reformation. And of course, this is conveniently untestable and unfalsifiable, so the doctrine cannot be historically verified and disproven, making it immune to factual scrutiny. Well, of course, we can show that these Albigenses and everyone else just dies out early on, or they were complete heretics. So yeah, I mean, but just hopefully you get the point there. Now, of course, this contradicts Christ's promise of a visible church. In Matthew 16:18, it stands in tension with Jesus' assurance that his church would be a visible, enduring community. It allows Protestants to claim any group as spiritual ancestors, which they did liberally. So if the church is invisible, you can include any dissenting group as part of your lineage. Very convenient. It means that church history becomes meaningless and entirely subjective. The invisible church idea makes historical investigation irrelevant, as true believers could be hidden anywhere. This opens the door to people like Bart Ehrman, who can claim there are many Christianities. Of course, if you have a certain doctrine with very clearly defined criteria, then anything outside of that is not a version of that. It's a falsification, a fabrication, something that is opposed to it. Gnostics, heretics. You have Christianity and you have Gnostics and heretics. As simple as that. Welcome, Oratex. How are you doing? Okay, let's continue. So this doctrine lacks clear biblical support, and it undermines the Protestant commitment to Scripture alone. So an observation I want to make here. Right, got about 14 slides to go. So scholars and even Protestant apologists, some at least, acknowledge that the proto-Protestant argument involving Waldensians, Albigensians, or even figures like Huss and Wycliffe as direct, unproblematic forerunners has been discredited in serious academic historical circles, because we now have far more access to primary sources because of the internet and because we've started to scan documents and make them available, we have better search methodologies. The software that I use can scan through thousands of documents in 2 seconds. I can look for a term through 25,000 documents in under 2 seconds and find references and then start pulling those out. So things of this type allow us to search through data and find things we couldn't before. So we have more rigorous methodologies, and we can find these differences in these quote-unquote early groups and the 16th century reformers. So they were able to make these claims, but now these claims can easily be proven false. There are discrepancies. The groups like the Albigensians, they rejected the incarnation. They're so fundamentally at odds with Christian orthodoxy, including Protestant orthodoxy, right? So you have Waldensians, they're a little bit closer to mainstream Protestantism, but these are still not something that you can point to as having a lineage back to the apostles or to be Protestants. The Protestants clearly differed from them, right? For many Protestants, the ultimate authority is, of course, sola scriptura, scripture alone. But if their doctrines are derived purely from scripture, then historical lineage becomes less necessary, even if it's desirable. So the argument then shifted historically from we were always here to we are faithful to the Bible. Of course, the 30,000, 40,000 plus groups can't quite decide what the Bible actually says or what is apostolic biblical interpretation because, again, they have irreconcilable, contradictory views. There's the embarrassment of association because they're associated with genuinely heretical views like the Albigensians or those whose historical continuity is tenuous, the invisible church. This undermines claims to orthodoxy or any kind of biblical fidelity or any kind of historical validity. So contemporary Protestant apologetics focuses more on theological arguments because they lost the historical argument. They completely lost the historical argument. There was no way they could prove any kind of apostolic lineage. And they eventually realized we've painted ourselves into a very dark corner by pointing at heretics and Gnostics. So basically they started saying, look, but the Reformation was necessary because of church corruption, indulgences. And that was the whole thing. Just hysterical panic over things, often overblown, right? We rediscovered biblical truth. We restored the Bible. Okay, so I've done a series of talks on groups, arbitrary groups you've never heard of, random whack jobs, complete lunatics, totally anonymous people that all claim to have rediscovered authentic original Christianity. There's hundreds of them. I've gone through a list of that, and these people have bizarre ideas, contradictory ideas, whack job ideas. You wouldn't even remotely recognize them as Christian, but they all claim they restored the original Christian faith. So anyway, so the emphasis here is on doctrinal purity and biblical faithfulness, quote unquote, not historical lineage. So this defense fell out of favor because it was so thoroughly debunked by careful historical analysis. So yeah, you have the uninformed, you try to push that, but yeah, there's nothing serious. The who, let me see, Albigensians, Waldensians. Sorry, that slide was a bit tiny. Apologies there, Maria. So what you have is historical revisionism. So they would only the Protestants would highlight passages from medieval texts that appear to support their views, while ignoring or omitting sections that contradict their theological positions. And of course, they would have these odd historical interpretations. So events and beliefs from the Middle Ages are frequently interpreted through a Reformation-era lens, attributing Protestant motives or doctrines to people and movements that never held them. But of course, this is all being proven to be false because we've got access to the original documents. We have far more insight now. So those we can all prove that this is false. But of course, then they also created mythologized narratives. You have stories of faithful remnant groups surviving in secret. And these groups, after they were finally able to break free from Catholic Church oppression, the victim card here, they were able to finally come back into the light and reveal to the world true apostolic Christianity. And of course, one has to wonder then, if Protestants are telling us this is the case, why did none of the reformers convert to those religions? Not one. So yeah. So another thing that I've come across, oh, and by the way, this faithful remnant group surviving in secret, that's a Muslim story as well. The Muslims tell exactly the same story. I've covered that in the past. on my discussion on polemics, right? On Islam versus St. Paul, this is exactly the same story in the Islamic sources, that they claim that they were the remnant group that was oppressed and suppressed by the Catholic Church. They went underground, they waited in secret for Muhammad to arrive, and then they revealed themselves in the person of Muhammad, and they took the religion of Jesus and they spread it to the world through Muhammad. And that's a Muslim story. It's not a new story. It's not original. Another thing I have noticed, there is deliberate misrepresentation of Catholic sources, right? Because I do find that Catholic writings and official documents are quoted out of context to make the Catholic Church appear corrupt or oppressive, to reinforce the victim narrative. Protestants good, Catholics evil. You do see that. So the primary goal was to undermine Catholic claims to apostolic succession. That was it. So the main objective was to challenge the Catholic Church's assertion of unbroken line of authority from the apostles through the popes, right? Weakening its claim to be the true church. And of course, historical accuracy was sacrificed for polemical advantage. This was purely an effort to be right, not an effort to be truthful. So unfortunately, this one happened. They were willing to embrace heretics just to oppose Rome, just to say our tent is bigger than your tent, right? So they aligned themselves with groups condemned by all of historical Christianity, simply because those groups opposed Catholicism. And this demonstrates that anti-Catholicism, not truth, drove Protestant myth-making and historiography. So they selected historical evidence that suit them, but let's just say it bit them eventually. This was also revealing in that it showed the fundamentally reactive nature of Protestant identity. So Protestant identity is protesting against what? Well, perpetually, always protesting against anything Catholic. So it's not an identity that stands on its own. It's an identity that stands in opposition to something. Think of theism, right? The belief in God, which is a long history, and atheism. Atheism is relatively new, but atheism cannot exist unless it stands against something. It has to stand against theism. Therefore, atheism is not neutral. It's not the lack of belief. It stands in opposition to something. The same thing, Protestantism stands in opposition to Catholicism. So while Protestants claim to be the early, true, and original church, they stand in opposition to the Catholic Church, which historically provably existed. So there's no independent tradition. It's merely a position in opposition to. And of course, I'll say bluntly that Protestant historical methodology is bankrupt. And this reveals a lack of scholarly rigor and undermines the credibility of any Protestant historical claims. So that section is now done. We go to the last one. And let me see if I've missed any comments. Protestants helped make America great. And does that change the fact that Protestants lied about history? That Protestants stood on the shoulders of heretics, people who disavowed Christ, people who denied the Old Testament, people who disliked large sections of the Bible, people who said that Jesus never existed, Jesus was never born, Jesus was just a spiritual being, that the God of the Bible is evil, the God of the Bible is Satan. Does that change the fact that Protestant forebears, the Protestant founders, referred to these people with these whack job beliefs as true Christians, good Christians? Does that change anything? Does your deflection change any of that? That you're standing on the shoulders of people who utterly and totally basically pointed to Satanists and explicitly antichrist Gnostic groups as those are the original Christians. No, it doesn't. It doesn't change anything. So Bob, Protestants built the nation. That's fantastic. Well, Catholics built the modern world, right? So if you want to think of it that way. So yeah. But that is a deflection. Yes, Bob, that's a deflection. That's called a deflection. We need to look at the foundation, you see, where Protestant ideas come from, and these ideas come straight out of a bunch of heretics, sadly. So yeah, that's a deflection. So anywho, no, I'm not Catholic. Bob, I get asked that question roughly every 30 seconds. No, I'm not Catholic. Believe it or not, I'm not. So no. I am simply showing history. Protestants lied. Martin Luther lied. John Wesley lied. Calvin, same. And there's a lot worse than that I can say, because historically these people were some of the worst people you'd come across. Martin Luther is responsible for massive numbers of deaths. Now, of course, you're going to go, well, but no. Let's just stick to the people that are being foisted on us as supposedly great theologians are shown to be people who just didn't have a clue. Right, and were willing to lie to perpetuate a myth, which obviously wasn't true, just to give themselves legitimacy. I'd say that is rather sad. Who supported Hitler? The Protestants, of course. Lutherans supported Hitler. That is, you should look at my series on Hitler. I go at length through the Protestant churches that actually went along with Hitler, that supported Hitler, and they actually went and rewrote the New Testament, stripped out large sections of it, and Nazified the rest of it to support Hitler. So, the people who supported Hitler was A, the Protestants, and B, the Muslims. Muslims and Protestants very strongly supported Hitler. So that's unfortunate, and embarrassing, but there you go. So the continuity problem. So what Protestants need is an unbroken chain of Orthodox believers. What they get is a scattered group of heretical sects with totally contradictory and fully anti-Christian doctrine. They need consistent doctrinal transmission. What they get is contradictory doctrines from groups that disappear in the 12th century, or that pop up in one place and then disappear. So there's no continuity, there's no legacy, no lineage. They need institutional continuity of a church. So they had to invent the invisible church because there is no institutional connection. They need to maintain biblical authority. What you find is that these groups completely reject biblical authority. They deny the Bible. They reject the God of the Bible. They call the God of the Bible Satan, effectively. So unfortunately, are Lutherans really, well, Lutherans founded your movement, Bob. Look, if you don't mind, Bob, you are clearly not up to speed here. You're clearly not knowledgeable enough of the topic. So I understand your sophistry. I understand your desire to deflect, to derail, and to, shall we say, dominate the conversation. But really, you're a little bit behind the curve. Maybe just listen a little bit. Maybe go back to previous discussion I've had on this and get yourself up to speed. But clearly, okay, Bob, enough, Bob. I'm going to give you one opportunity to just be quiet, get with the program, and listen, because I understand the information hurts you. I understand the truth is very painful for you. It's very awkward and difficult for you to deal with the facts that Protestant foundations are, shall we say, myth. They are lies, and they are based on support of heresy, anti-Christian, blatantly anti-Christian heresy. And all of these Protestant forefathers, all of these Protestant church fathers supported this. They pointed to this as good Christianity, and we can prove now that they were simply making up fabricated stories to give themselves a lineage which they cannot prove. Yes, I'm the truth, and you have, Bob, you can leave permanently. So thank you and goodbye. Right, now, so we have doctrinal contradictions. The Waldensians practice confession to laymen, which contradicts against, again, Protestant priesthood doctrine. But then, of course, you get Protestants who don't have that kind of doctrine, and then they fall in with the Waldensians. So you have groups all over the place, interacting with groups all over the place. So there will be accidental connections. They will come to the same doctrines, whether by accident or by design. So now the Waldensians allowed confessions of sins to any lay person. So you can go to any random, you can go to your baker, your barber, your dentist, and this directly opposes the Protestant emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and the rejection of sacramental confession. But then, of course, Protestantism is a very big tent, so there's going to be someone who has exactly that belief. Or if you just wait 10 minutes, someone's going to come up with a church that does that. The Albigensians rejected the Old Testament, and they contradicted Protestant biblical authority, right? So the Albigensians dismissed the Old Testament. Sola Scriptura, the Bible alone. Yeah, we don't like the Bible. Throw out that book. Throw out the whole Old Testament. Okay, yeah, that's good Christian practice. So yeah, they said that the Old Testament was the work of an evil God. And this, of course, undermines the principle of the entire Bible as the sole rule of faith. But the Protestant founders were like, yeah, that's good stuff. Those are Christians. The Cathars practiced extreme asceticism, which contradicted the Protestant view of marriage. Catholic leaders condemned marriage and procreation, which, again, of course, marriage is a divine institution. But then, of course, Martin Luther did not believe that marriage was a divine institution. He did not believe it was a sacrament. So, yeah, your bartender. Yeah, exactly, your bartender. Very good point. Pastor Bob. Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, well, what are you going to do with someone who refuses to listen, refuses to believe? Well, what can you do with that? They're simply going to refuse all evidence. He's not asking questions to learn. He's asking questions to derail. right? It's kind of why Lloyd is so fired about this. This hits home when he found it out. Like when a Catholic who confronts issues in his plot is more angry than issues in Protestant churches. Yeah, I think so. No, it means I got lied to. I was misled. I was part of a movement that is clearly based on false history. It is disturbing. So the Cathars, of course, but then again, these what I'm referencing here, these are things that are generally true of one group of Protestants, but then it's opposed directly by another group. So there's no consistency there either. So yeah, what can we say? Many groups rejected infant baptism, others rejected it. So there was no consensus on baptism. Some groups denied infant baptism, others retained it. And of course, other groups just rejected it completely. So yeah, where do you stand? It hasn't changed much within Protestant circles today. And there were inconsistent views on sacraments across these ancestors that are original Christians. And so they were just incompatible. So there was no coherent theological tradition, none. It's just confusion based on confusion. So lineage. Now, this is from a paper called Waldensianism and English Protestants, The Construction of Identity and Continuity. This is by Mira Goldberg Poch, written in 2012. So it says here, Protestants also use the Waldensians in propagandist documents, most often to justify political or religious actions and ideologies. So she's mentioning here, she's discussing the Waldensians, right? The continuity of Waldensianism through the Reformation became crucially important for the wider umbrella of Protestantism as a legitimizing factor for the movement. This thesis investigates the claims of continuity. And while the Waldensians underwent a dramatic change in religious doctrine to conform to the Reformation, their belief in their continuity of their religious identity can be validated. So now we're going to learn something very interesting. Remember, the Protestant, all the Reformation leaders were saying, see, these groups, these ancient groups that can't be traced past the 12th century or whatever, these ancient groups, original suppressed Christians, the true apostolic Christians that were suppressed by those evil Catholics, that are now presenting to us genuine, authentic, original early Christianity, and we are based on them. But of course, not one of them converted to that religion. They all formed their own doctrines. These Cathars, these Waldensians, these groups became Calvinists. So wait, you have the original apostolic Christians, and then they became Calvinists. Don't you think Calvin should become a Waldensian or an Albigensian? So, and then when you look at the differences between their doctrines are extremely different. These Protestants were all saying that these Albigensians, Waldensians, and you name them, whatever, were all original, authentic Christians. And instead of them joining these guys and becoming Waldensians or whatever, or Albigensians, these groups all converted into the Calvinist church. So if they were identical, why would they have such different doctrine, and why would then they become Calvinists? Good question. So contemporary scholars tell us that Waldensians have been fully absorbed into Protestantism after 1532. And this is clear from the writings of both the Waldensians and their sympathizers. They considered themselves as a separate entity. They were the inheritors of a long tradition of descent from the Catholic Church based on their own belief in the purity of the gospel. Bible alone. Martin Luther copied that, and of course this can be then found in heretical groups. The Waldensian identity was based on a history of exclusion and persecution, the persecution tale, the sympathy vote here, and a belief that they had transmitted the true embodiments of Christianity through the centuries. English and continental Protestants identified with the Waldensians who provided ancient ties and legitimacy to their new religion. But the Waldensians became Calvinists. So the earliest firm origin for this particular group is the 12th century, not apostolic. And documentary evidence begins with Peter Waldo in the 1170s. And these ancient Vaudois, right, backdating is polemical, not sourced, which is they say, no, but we come from this other group that was hidden underground. Very convenient. So let me go. In the age of the internet, research the heck out of everything and follow the truth, So if a Protestant comes up to you and says their beliefs are the same as the early church before Reformation, they must find people that believed exactly how they do, with zero deviations, precisely. So the only consistent, unquestionable through line that can be traced is descent. Yes, that is very, very true. So communal practices and memory persisted, but that's a social continuity, because these identity, they claim that they persisted throughout the centuries, That's a belief they have, but it's not something they can prove, right? This doesn't mean, so this claim is not proof of apostolic lineage. It's not a traceable claim of doctrine, office, or sacraments, because no, there is no such proof, no such evidence. There was a sharp doctrinal shift in 1532 at Chanforan. So the Waldensians officially then aligned with Reformed theology, adopting Swiss Reformed confessional norms, Calvinism, undercutting claims of stable apostolic fidelity, saying we've had the same belief since the beginning when they became Calvinists. Why didn't the Calvinists become Waldensians? And of course, they had differences in belief. So these guys left their religion and became Calvinists. So that seriously, that just totally destroys the idea that this is original and apostolic, or at least, yeah. So Reformers, they merged the Waldensians, the Vaudois, the Lollards, the Hussites, even the Albigensians into one quote-unquote remnant to mask differences and contradictions. So they played games, right? This whole idea of the Waldensians coming from what they call the French Vaudois, which is another early group. This was used to imply antiquity, right? It's not historical evidence. It's just word games to try to prove antiquity. Yeah, I'll skip over a couple of things. So Protestants need to, they needed to drive the narrative because of their polemical needs. They need to win the argument. So where was your church before Luther? Basically incentivized the manufactured genealogy to counter Catholic claims that you guys are new. And they failed the apostolic test. There was no chain of transmission. There's no continuous ordination. There are no institutional records. There is no stable doctrinal corpus from Antiquity to Waldo-era communities. And from Waldo-era communities to Calvin, again, it changed. Doctrine changed. There is no consistency, nothing. And then, of course, their doctrine completely changed when they adopted Calvinism in 1532. Insanity. So the primary goal was to undermine any Catholic claims to apostolic succession, apostolic claims for Catholicism to be the true church, right? And of course, they distorted, they ignored, undermined, and so on, anything that didn't go with the Protestant view, right? So they simply just played word games. So anti-Catholicism, not truth, drove the whole Protestant movement. So I'll skip over a couple of things. I mean, you get the point. So if Rome was always apostate, a couple of questions. If Rome was always apostate, if the great apostasy happened on day 3 or something of after Jesus's ascension, how did it preserve scripture? Because we get the Bible from the Catholic Church. So canon formation, all of the manuscripts, all the liturgical use were transmitted through the very church that Protestants deemed was corrupt. So they call the church corrupt, but yet they use that church's Bible. Just like Muslims claim the Bible is corrupt and then claim that the Bible proves Muhammad. And they can't prove that there was a different Bible. They can't produce an Injil. There's no record of an Injil. These two arguments parallel each other, and that's very disturbing to me to see that the whole Islamic argument and the Protestant argument are far too similar. If the remnant, quote unquote, this remnant, these heretics and Gnostics were doctrinally faithful, why did they change allegiance and join the Calvinists in 1532? So Chanforan's reformed realignment implies that there was a prior deficiency or some kind of rupture, but not continuous adherence to original apostolic truth. So if medieval forebears were orthodox, why did they have all of this heretical, provably heretical baggage, the dualism, the Gnostic stuff, right? This all cannot be squared with Catholic or Reformed orthodoxy or just basic historical Christianity or just anything that's common in the Bible. And if there's true succession, where's the chain of transmission? Where's the evidence that they carried on a legacy, a lineage? None. So there's no continuous ordination, there's no episcopal oversight, there's no stable confessional corpus from Antiquity to Waldo. And of course, this is inconsistent with the claim of Roman apostasy or Roman Catholic apostasy, because Protestants rely on a canon and manuscripts transmitted by the medieval church that they call corrupt, which is nuts. So the medieval forebears that were supposedly original Christians carried heterodoxies, heretics. So none of this can be squared. So there's no chain of transmission. So there's no continuous line of ordination, and the 1532 Reformed turn confirms a discontinuity, right? Why would you need to make a change? Why would you have a new confession if these guys are original Christians? Why would you have to form something new and then these guys have to join your church? And take on your beliefs. That makes no sense. So if these are early Christians, why did the leaders of these early Christian churches publicly adopt Calvinism in 1532? And please answer me. Seriously, please answer me this question. And Grafted says, yeah, that's a pretty good question, not gonna lie. Yeah. So let me see. Doesn't simply knowing who Jesus is claiming as he's repenting from enough qualification to be Christians? No, of course not. Yeah, but of course, look, I mean, these are all revolts against authority. These are all efforts to assert yourself. I'll cover that a little bit. I mean, I've covered that in the past. So, for instance, Waldensians, a religious body dating from the Middle Ages, not from Antiquity. The town of Valdez was founded by the members of this group in 1893. And this is from the Division of Archives and History, 1973. If the Waldensians were the continuous early Christian church, then yes, by their own logic, reformers should have conformed to Waldensian doctrine, not the other way around. So the historical record shows Waldensians aligning to Reformed Chanfaran, 1532, not Calvinists or Lutherans aligning to a pre-existing Waldensian confession. And of course, the community with the claimed apostolic continuity should set the doctrinal norm. These original apostolic group should set the doctrinal norm. They become Calvinists. Kind of weird. So that didn't happen. So this asymmetry shows us that the Waldensians were incorporated into Reformed Protestantism, and they were not, let me just take this away quickly. So they were not the carriers of a stable apostolic deposit to which others returned. Everybody was claiming that they had just restored the church, the whole restorationist movement. We have restored the original church because we found the original Christians. But of course, this is not true because these guys left their beliefs and became Calvinists. So, last 4 slides, then I'm done. The historical method failure. So, Protestant historians do begin with conclusions and they seek supporting evidence. So they start with an outcome and look for facts to fit. Contradictory evidence is ignored or explained away. Sources are quoted out of context to support their narratives, right? They selectively quote history. I've seen this often with selective quotations of the early church fathers. When I started reading the early church fathers, I was realizing that Protestant quotations were very selective and we failed to provide a full context because they'll say the Bible is critical to everything. The Bible is our rock, our foundation. And then they'll go on in the next paragraph and say, and however, the church is the guardian of that Bible and we must adhere to the church's interpretation. We follow the church in its interpretation of the Bible. We don't do our own interpretations. But of course, the Protestants will then simply say, well, this guy said the Bible alone is the foundation and rock of Christianity, which is true. But then, of course, they forget all of the rest conveniently. So now this historical methodology is subordinated to a theological agenda. So this is what the Muslims do. Their theological goals take precedence over objective historical analysis. Why do Muslims claim that Pharaoh was a Muslim, that Pharaoh worshipped Allah? I mean, no one had heard of Allah in that part of the world by then, and of course everyone worshipped Re or Ra, right? And they had a whole host of other gods. Allah was not around. Pharaoh was not a Muslim. Why does the Quran make these claims? Well, these false claims. Well, unfortunately, we got a situation where Protestants were making very similar claims. So this ends up distorting history, right? And of course, this violates basic principles of scholarly historical research. That undermines academic standards and the support and the pursuit of truth because it simply is there to win the argument, not find truth. So these claims undermine their own theological foundations, right? This is a questionable historical narrative. Protestants weaken the very principles like biblical authority and doctrinal purity that their theology is supposed to be built upon when they rely on people that are against both. So last few slides. The theological implications. So reliance on heretical groups contradicts claims to orthodoxy, right? Citing groups with fundamentally opposed doctrines to Christianity is not a good move, not a good plan, not a good look, right? An invisible church doctrine also makes ecclesiology utterly meaningless. So the idea of an invisible church strips the church of any kind of concrete identity. This makes it impossible to define or recognize the true church in any meaningful way. If you're the church, I'm the church, everybody's the church, we all get a Toyota, then nobody can claim authority. Everyone then comes up with their own personal, private, contradictory view of what doctrine says. And then all you have is chaos, and we have that today. Of course, this revisionism shows dishonest methodology, and the selective use and distortion of historical evidence shows a lack of integrity. And the anti-Catholic motivation, of course, I think that's quite clear. So they are reacting against Catholicism rather than imposing a positive identity. And all of the identity groups that they glom onto have totally contradictory sets of doctrines. And these groups eventually joined them. So yeah, not good. So the whole thing calls into question the Protestant project. So all of these issues cast very serious doubt on the legitimacy, the coherence of Protestantism's claim to be an authentic continuation of apostolic Christianity. Well, hopefully so far all of this makes good sense to everyone. So yeah, let me see. Who said that that's sufficient? Do you think that the apostles like Saint Irenaeus did not know that when you said you need more? Yeah, so Numos, I noticed that didn't Rome come from the Great Schism? If you look through the writings on the Great Schism, I've covered that before, called the Great Apostasy. Have a look at my talk on the Great Apostasy. I go through this. It's another set of bizarre historical takes from Protestants. Everyone's claiming to have restored true Christianity, and none of them can agree on what that is. But this is hundreds of people. I cover about 10 or 12 people. I go through depth about maybe 4 of them, 4 groups. It's just totally bizarre. But no, Rome is historically based. But if you look at the claims, but let's have a look at the claim of the Great Schism. When did it happen? On a Tuesday at 4 p.m. in 331 AD? Or did it happen on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. in 35 AD? Or did it happen on a Friday at 6 p.m. in 1521? Or did it happen in 1501 on a Sunday at 2 p.m.? See, no one can somehow agree. They all conveniently don't have a clear idea of when this happened, but it did happen. I tell you, it definitely happened. Definitely happened. We just don't know exactly when. It's very unclear. We'll get right back to you with the details in a minute. So pretty much that's how solid that claim is. The Great Schism. The Great Schism can't prove itself. It's laughably stupid. It's another one of these ridiculous claims that are just made up, clearly made up. No one can agree what, when, how. It's, yeah. Take care, Grafted. Good to have you here. We'll see you next time. Yeah, very gradually. The problem is that to you it's very gradually, but you see, to the guy next to you, it was very suddenly. It happened at exactly 4 p.m. on a Friday in 422, you see. So the problem is no one can agree when it happened, because you have great scholar A, who's a great man of God, an apostle of God in the Church of God, in the original Church of God, who says it happened like this. And then you got the other guy who says it happened like that. And then you get the third guy who says, no, 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 no. And so you see, it's just another set of lies and fabrications that people have made up to justify their position that clearly no one can agree. Utterly contradictory claims. There is no solid background, evidence, foundation to any of this. I've covered this before. It's laughably stupid. It's as stupid as the claims that Protestant founders made about heresies that were true Christianity. So looking at the Catholic response, right? The Catholic Church does provide very clear institutional continuity from apostolic times. Their story is consistent, right? So the Catholic Church traces its leadership, its structure, and its sacramental life in an unbroken link back to the apostles. And of course, when you read the earliest written documents we have, they're all Catholic. When you read the early church fathers, when you read back as early as the Didache, all of these practices are undeniably Catholic. They're not Protestant, they're not Baptist. All of these documents, all of the written evidence, when you look for written evidence for the Protestant claims, it's clearly garbage. It's historical garbage. It's unprovable nonsense. There is consistent doctrinal development under magisterial authority. So Catholic teaching has developed organically and authoritative to the guidance of the Church's magisterium, maintaining unity and fidelity, right? The Catholic Church does not rely on fringe or heretical movements to establish its legitimacy. It stands firmly on its own history and doctrine. It doesn't go to strange-ass groups to prove itself. Historical records, and that's the written record, the historical record does support Catholic claims to apostolic succession, right? We've got about 263 popes or something like that, 270 popes going back. And don't forget, Protestants have claimed since Luther that Pope Leo X of Luther's day was the Antichrist, not an Antichrist, the Antichrist. So Revelation has come and gone. Did you know the book of Revelation has come and gone, according to Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, and every other Protestant who follows their confessions? According to the Westminster Confession, according to a numerous number of confessions. I've covered that before. Several Protestant confessions, the largest Protestant confessions, all claim the Pope is the Antichrist. Of course, we've had about 150 popes since then. The end times has not happened. Revelation has not come true. But yet, Luther, Calvin, all of these whack jobs all claim that the Pope is the Antichrist. But of course, this prediction has failed about 150 times. It's clearly a lie. It's a polemic. It's designed to undermine the Catholic Church, bolster their position by repeating a provable lie. It's a provable lie that stands in these churches today. Not all Protestants, yes, but then not all Protestants believe the same thing. 73% of America's Protestants believe that Jesus is not God. So yeah, not all Protestants. Well, you all fall under the same umbrella where everybody has invented his own belief. Everybody has made up his own doctrine. Everyone has become his own pope in his own church and made up his own nonsense. 73% of American evangelicals don't believe Jesus is God, do not believe in the Trinity. 73% of American Protestants, evangelicals, are heretics. That evangelical banner includes a whole bunch of different groups that fall under that. So yeah, not all. So you personally may believe something nice and correct, but unfortunately, you have zero authority, this much, to influence the guy next to you, because you have no doctrinal authority. There is no adjudicator. There's no arbitrator that can discipline everybody, because no one adheres to the same authority. Many people adhere to themselves as the only authority and interpreter. I believe in the Bible alone. No one tells me. Well, then you've got millions of different churches. So all you have is subjectivism. All you have is personal opinion masquerading as Christianity. And no one can agree. And that's why we have tens of thousands of different denominational splits. So, yeah, there were many. The Antichrist, yeah. So, yeah, who knows? So let me see. Have I missed anything? Numos said, good points. I see what you're saying. It's something I've not been able to figure out. So let me continue, but thank you, guys. So the wild Protestant attempts at historical revisionism only strengthen the Catholic position, which hasn't changed. It's stayed the same, right? So efforts to rewrite or reinterpret history only highlight the lack of Protestant continuity, and shows that the Catholic Church has been telling the same story for a long time. Now, of course, this is not to say that Protestants don't misrepresent the Catholic story, but that said, once you dig past that sort of propaganda, you start to find the Catholic Church has been very consistent. So where was your church before Luther? This remains unanswered. Where was your church before Luther? And Protestants for hundreds of years have tried to answer this and failed, and eventually gave up. And then eventually they said, no, we're biblical. That was the solution. We're biblical. Okay, what does that mean? Because you guys can't decide. So if you're biblical and the Holy Spirit leads you into all truth, then why does Calvin believe that you don't have the double predestination and Arminius believes in free will? This is a 500-year-old quandary that has not been fixed. And that's just one example, but that's like the famous example, because they come to contradictory positions. So the Holy Spirit must be the author of confusion then. The Holy Spirit must be the author of contradictory doctrines. It must be messing with people. Simple. Or someone is wrong. Someone is very wrong. Yeah, and there's no way to sort this out because there's no adjudicator. There is no authority that is valid. For instance, the person that spoke earlier, what authority do you have or does your church have to go to the other guy and tell him he's a heretic and to fix his ways? Zero, because he doesn't fall under your authority. He doesn't listen to it. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't respect it. His church has a completely different set of views. And of course, if someone disagrees within that church with the priest, they'll just start their new church tomorrow. And that guy might decide, you know what, I don't need a church. I follow the Bible and I make up my own story from the Bible. And so there is no authority. There is no way to impose any kind of coherence on this because everyone rejects authority. It is rebellion. Simple. It is rebellion against authority. Don't tell me what to think. I'll do what the hell I please. That's all it comes down to. Just rebellion. So, guys, last two slides. And yeah, that's the Muslim view, Maria. So, oh, distant horizon. Oh, I'm Catholic. My observation was intended being ironic. Sorry. Yeah, it's hard to understand tone through text. Maria, no one deleted your comment. Could have been too long. It's possible. Numa says, I think that this question, where was your church for Luther, is a hard pill to swallow because it will force many to reconsider their entire belief system. And I believe this is true, yes. I've had many people write to me. They leave comments. I get emails. They tell me that they try to talk to their Protestant families about some of these questions. They raise some of these problems. For instance, Martin Luther's desire to murder the disabled. And they say, look, I mean, this guy claimed to be receiving true revelation and to be the true revelation of Jesus and God in the Bible, and he stood on the Bible alone, and he said we have to murder the disabled because they're just sacks of meat possessed by Satan. And how do you square that with and the family don't want to listen, don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it. And that's just one example. I can go through plenty with my Luther series I have. It's I'd like to see medicine practiced that way. Solar surgery. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Yeah, it's hard for people to go against their belief system. So yeah, last two slides, guys, and we're basically done. I've been going for 1 hour, 11 minutes. So Protestant historical methodology influences contemporary apologetics. So the patterns of selective history, revisionism, that comes from the Reformation shapes how Protestant apologists defend their tradition today. There's selective use of evidence that is in modern Protestant scholarship. I've come across plenty of it. I watch so much of it or read so much of it. So yeah, they downplay evidence that undermines their position, right? Anti-Catholic bias still distorts historical interpretation. Prejudice against Catholic Church often leads to misrepresentation or unfair criticism in both academic and popular Protestant writings. In fact, you even see it in politics. And you can see it historically. It played out in the US, in the UK. You see it played out in basically prejudice towards Catholics in various spheres, socially, politically, legally. You see it. I think all of these issues, people need to really think about this and then step back and re-examine all the Protestant claims, because you have repeated methodological flaws, you have inconsistencies. This means we should critically reevaluate Protestant arguments about history and Protestant legitimacy. I do believe that honest historical investigation does lead towards the Catholic Church. So when the evidence is examined objectively and comprehensively, it consistently points to the Catholic Church's continuity and authority and stability, right? Despite being a human institution with its own flaws, it is not as retarded as what I've seen within the Protestant historical claims. And the logical and historical case, I think, for Protestantism does collapse under scrutiny. So I think a careful analysis reveals that Protestantism's claims, well, I just cannot speak today, sorry about that, do not withstand historical or logical examination. And this is not my first foray into this. I've covered numerous historical issues. And unfortunately, this I do believe does leave the Catholic position as extremely solid by comparison. So last slide, conclusion, the verdict of history. So Protestant attempts to establish a pre-Reformation legitimacy historically completely failed, right? The desire to trace Protestant beliefs and communities back before the Reformation did not produce any kind of credible results. See if I've missed any comments. Luther never wanted to leave the Pope. He had to, though. No, that's not true, Ophelia. I understand there are popular narratives about Martin Luther. I have about 32 hours, maybe more, maybe slightly less. I have approximately 30 hours of very detailed examination of Luther on my channel. I bought an entire copy with the help of my supporters on the channel. We bought an entire series of Martin Luther's works. I spent years reading through them. I have dozens of hours of Martin Luther's works. I'm actually going to be doing Luther tomorrow. I've got to cancel the show I was going to do. I'll be on with Usama Dakdok tomorrow to discuss Martin Luther again, to do more on Martin Luther's works. And if you read Martin Luther, the popular story about Martin Luther, the popular narrative is about as true as the popular narrative of Muhammad. The theologians, the academics, have flatly just lied about Martin Luther. When you read Martin Luther himself, the most disturbing picture emerges of the worst kind of man. Martin Luther is not what people portray him to be. His own writings condemn him as a most vile, evil, genuinely disgusting figure. I was shocked reading through this. You're welcome to look at his works on my channel, but the story of he never wanted to leave the nonsense. No, Martin Luther wanted to kill handicapped people. He recommended that a boy that was suffering from a particular disease that we know today, he said, this boy is possessed by the devil, we should kill him. He recommended that he be drowned underwater, or someone put a pillow over his face and suffocate him to death. So that was the Martin Luther approach. And of course the Nazis said, yeah, you know what we need to do? We need to follow Martin Luther, good Christian that he was, and we'll implement Martin Luther's advice on how to deal with the handicap. And they killed 250,000 of them because Luther. And of course, then everyone goes, no, the Nazis misrepresented and misinterpreted. No, they just applied Martin Luther's ideas. They didn't misrepresent Martin Luther's ideas about Jews. They just applied them. They just literally said, okay, we're going to do what Luther said. And then they killed a bunch of people. Because Luther said, kill them. Simple. So, yeah, simple as that. And if Protestants' position is true, then re-examination will create a better case for them. Yeah, if not, then I should tell you something. Yeah. So, yeah, this is very disturbing. So let me finish this last slide. Let me get this last page done. So Protestant attempts to establish pre-Reformation legitimacy have failed. I think we've seen through. I think I've gone through this. Previously, remember on a previous talk with Mal, I went through the entire document. Now this is a re-examination of the document from a different angle. But previously I read through the document itself, and it's crazy what the Protestants were saying. I mean, it's insanity. For 200 years, the claims they were making and how the claims shifted, right? So historical evidence does contradict Protestants at every turn. The actual record of Christian history consistently undermines the Protestant narratives of ancient continuity. Logical contradictions permeate the Protestant historical narrative. And this is unfortunate. This is very, very true. And attempts to reconcile the reform with claims of unbroken tradition just leaves glaring problems. The reliance on heretical groups undermines any claims to orthodoxy. We've covered that plenty. The Catholic challenge, where was your church before Luther, is still unanswered, right? Of course, we can find that many of these ideas were found in heresy, were found in Gnostics, who are not Christians. So many of these ideas before Luther were found in groups that nobody would think or should think is Christian. That's where many of these ideas come from. So Protestants definitely, according to the evidence, have not provided a convincing response to this question. And I think genuinely, given just the basic logic, this leaves the Catholic position unchallenged. And history testifies to the truth of Catholic historical claims. Looking at my reading of the situation and the evidence, the Catholic historical claims are sound. And the Catholic presentation of history is very sound. Generally, I find Catholic theologians, Catholic authors, Catholic historians far more reliable, far more logical, far more credible than I do Protestants. Some great Protestants, granted, and there's some whack job Catholics. I've come across some crazy whack jobs. But that said, consistency, I would go with a Catholic history 9 times out of 10. Granted, there's some very good Protestant histories, and I do see a change. I do see a greater honesty. I do see a greater, because of the internet, we're seeing more history available to us. We can do better analysis. So I do see a change. So there's a bankruptcy in the Protestant narrative, and the weight of historical evidence, to me, affirms the Catholic Church's continuity and historical position. Of course, anyone can dispute it, but historically, the documents are there. The evidence is there. It's not invisible. It's written. It's in books. You can see them. And also, it shows the Catholic authority, the stability, right, the lineage, and it exposes the severe inadequacy of the Protestant alternatives. So let me see. It is right to make sure this matters, so we love God honestly with the whole heart, mind, and soul. Yes, thank you. Martin Luther was severely anti-Semitic. In fact, I've just done some work on that. Martin Luther wanted. Hold on, let me try and find you this document actually. Let me actually find you. I'm glad you raised that. Oh, good grief. Sorry, I'm trying to find this document now because okay, I don't have the original document, but I think this may help here. Actually, no, let me try again. It might not be this one. Okay, so, okay, it seems, let me see if I have Luther here. Okay, no, sorry. Okay, Luther says in one of his works, his last speech in one of the last speeches before he dies, he speaks about the Jews, and he says, what he says is, we were wrong in not killing them. I don't have the exact quote now offhand. I can't think of it offhand, but Luther states, in relation to the Jews, we were at fault in not killing them, right? So Luther, one of the last things he says before he dies, 3 days before he dies, he says that Christians, at least the Lutherans, should have wiped out the Jews. This is a claim by Martin Luther. What he recommended was, if you read his book on the Jews and their lies, he recommends that the Jews be punished. He recommends that they be forced to work, right, into forced labor. That's why, of course, the Nazis, when they put the Jews into the camps here in Poland, where I live, and in Germany and so on, they had Arbeit macht frei, work makes free, right? Because that was a Lutheran suggestion. That was the suggestion of Martin Luther, that they should be forced into labor, right? He recommended that their synagogues be destroyed, be burned, that their holy books be destroyed and burned, that their money gets taken, that they are exiled, they're cast out, they're forced into labor camps, they're punished. So Martin Luther recommended a whole bunch of things, which are pretty gruesome. I'm going to be talking about this in the near future, but he made some seriously nasty suggestions. He says we were at fault in not wiping them out, or something like that. We were at fault in not exterminating them, something like that. And the Nazis just went, okay, fine, we'll just do what Luther said. So yeah, it's pretty bad, actually. So yeah, so I think that was the end of that. That's the end of that. But so let me see if I've missed anything. Ower says, doesn't mean we don't have our own issues, especially with institutional corruption and such that rears its head. But with all these issues, the fact that we're still standing is a miracle. Exactly. Don't forget, Jesus does say, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He will establish a church. Now, this doesn't mean the church won't deal with issues. It has to constantly renew itself in the sense of dealing with issues, refreshing itself, cleaning itself out. It's a human institution, but it is guided. Whereas if you look at what Protestants, it's kind of this, it's fractured. It's all over the place. There is a house divided cannot stand. And that is a house divided. So you cannot find any consistency or reliability within it. So I would think that's a serious problem. So let me just close that. Let me just see. Yeah, he contradicts his own beloved Paul. Yeah, exactly. Martin Luther was insane, honestly. Yeah, let me see. Thanks again, Lloyd, for another great video. That brings a lot together. You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, Luther wasn't the only to hate Jews in the church. All churches, yes, that is true. There's blood on Christians' hands. They were hateful and they were very bad Christians towards Jews. But don't forget that a lot of this starts with heretics and Gnostics who hated Jews because the Jews worshipped the evil god, right? The demiurge. The whole Gnostic thing. They started to twist the Bible, like John 8:44. You're of your father the devil. They claimed that actually said no. You are of the father of the devil. so that they worshipped a greater demon, a greater evil than the devil himself. They worshipped the father of the devil. And that debate still rages today, believe it or not, in academia. I've covered that previously. I've gone through some scientific paper on that. It was insane. It's nuts. So you look at the Gnostics, and of course, yes, you'll find individual Catholics, and even the Catholic Church is guilty of certain crimes. Granted, human institutions do foul things, do bad things. And of course, Martin Luther, though, did make it much, much worse. Martin Luther accused the Jews of lots of crimes. He, increased this whole idea of the blood libel. He developed conspiracy theories that even Hamas uses today, believe it or not. So what you've got is the Catholic Church eventually had to catch itself. The Catholic Church had to eventually change its doctrine and make a positional statement, right? So the Catholic Church veered the other way and tried to sort itself out. But again, who speaks for the Protestants? There is no one single authority that can discipline and impose doctrine on all Protestants. You have no such authority. That is a problem. So maybe you personally, you have no issue with Jews, but that doesn't mean you can influence your church or the other Protestant denomination that doesn't respect your view, because they follow the Bible only, don't they? And they make it up as they go along to suit themselves. So yeah, it's just, there's too much division. There's no way to impose authority. So the Catholic Church did fix that within itself. However, another thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the claims against the Catholic Church are often exaggerated, often just outright fabrications, plain old lies. So it's really tough it takes time to sort out all of this. Sure, you can point to problems, but we do need to take time to straighten out all the history and to just find the truth, because, there's just way too much garbage. But now we have the tools, we have access to the history, we can find the truth. It is possible. There are Jews and then there are Jews. You are commanded to pray for peace, but also, yes, granted. And there are Christians and they are Christians. 73% of American evangelicals don't believe Jesus is God, don't believe in the Trinity, don't believe in the Holy Spirit as one of the persons in the Trinity. 73%. 73% of American evangelicals are outright heretics, claiming to be inspired by the Holy Spirit and based on the Bible alone. Nonsense. Trash. Garbage. They're not Christians. They're not Christians, period. They're heretics. They're Arians. They're Gnostics. They're full of nonsense. So a large swathe of America's, like 40% of American Christians generally are not even remotely Christian, pretending to be, yes, claiming to be, definitely. Are they Christian? Absolutely not. They don't even believe in basic principles of Christianity. Jesus is God. Jesus was born on earth as a man, lived, died, resurrected. Don't believe that stuff, but they're Christians. Garbage. So, yep, hairy ticks, very hairy ticks. Interesting with the stream where you can get through. Yeah, look, I do try my best to engage with the chat, and I have a very active chat, which is great, and I've got some very well-informed people in the chat, very educated people in the chat, and I do try to occasionally I'll bring people on to have discussions about the topic, and I'll bring up people here and there to have talks. So yeah, but this is true. I've covered this previously. I've covered it in the previous episode, and I've done an entire series on that, going through the statistics. It's really scary. You got to look at the actual statistical breakdown. If you guys want, let me know in the comments later. I will do a talk just on the statistical breakdown of the surveys done on American Christianity. It's in the toilet. It's really, really bad. It's genuinely bad. Lucifer, yeah. So thank you, Porfirio. So guys, I think that's it. Yeah, hopefully you've learned something valuable. Hopefully you've gained something here and something to think about. I know it's not easy. I know it takes time to absorb all of this, and I know it's hard to take it in. And I understand there's lots of people that will get in the way, but look, I think I've applied basic history and basic logic. I've provided the references to the papers that you can look at. You can read them, check the history for yourself. It's unfortunate, but it's true, and it's what it is. So tomorrow I was supposed to be on with the Green Beret. Guy recently retired from the Green Berets to talk about information warfare, about geopolitics, and about how Christians deal with this kind of thing, the kind of things that we can do as Christians to fight back in the information space on social media, and the kind of attitudes we need to have to deal with the problems we're seeing in the world today, how we can push back. But unfortunately, he has to go out of town, apparently, he says, so he needs to push this back. He wants to do it on the 2nd. I'm not sure I'm available because I have Osama scheduled every 2nd. And I'm traveling that week as well. I'll be in Germany. So yeah, basically, So I'm going to try and push him to the 8th, something like that. So I'll have him on, and I think that will be a very interesting discussion. Hopefully that goes off. It's very hard to schedule with people. With many people, it's very difficult. So yeah, guys, any final questions? And then I move on. Numos, thank you. Love you, brother. Thank you. God bless. Yes, maybe we'll be guided into the fullness of truth. Yeah, interesting. AE says, interesting how old those thought concepts are. Yeah, some of them go back centuries. Some of them go back to the pagan Greeks. Many of them actually can be traced back to pagan Greeks. Believe it or not, it's insanity. Many of the ideas from atheists go back to the pagan Greeks. In fact, Darwin's ideas can be traced back to the Sufis, to Sufi poetry and Sufi mythology, as well as ancient pagan Greeks from like 500 BC. Welcome, Tom. Good to see you back from church. Thank you for your service for the truth. Yeah, welcome. So guys, I think I will see you guys tomorrow evening, probably on with Usama, to talk about Martin Luther. I'll cover some of this stuff on Martin Luther's hatred of Jews, but I'm going through a structured approach to talk about the Reformation and Martin Luther's ideas. And what Martin Luther said and what people say he said, what historians and theologians say about Martin Luther are very different. When you read Martin Luther, it's like it's a cross somewhere between Hitler and Muhammad. And you go like, this can't be true. But sadly, it's coming right out of the mouth of the man called Martin Luther. I'll leave it at that. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. So good night, guys. God bless. And I will see you soon. Take care and good night.